One of the other final major differences when you start talking about a field service implementation versus your standard Dynamics 365 implementation is around the inventory management and the back office scenarios. And oftentimes when you start talking about and having these discussions with your organization or your customers, you really start kind of talking more along the lines of an ERP implementation, because now we're talking about under what circumstances are we going to trigger invoices, how are we going to handle inventory reductions, or is that going to be done from within the concept of field service, or is that going to be done through ERP and then transferred over into field service? Are we going to do integrated billing directly from the application? Are we going to be processing returns? Are we going to be doing purchase orders? All of those decisions that you make drive how you want to move forward within the context of the application. Now, while we're not necessarily going to dive very deep into that scenario here, it's important to understand the components that make up some of the back office and back office functionality inside field service. But more often than not, that's going to be a situation where you're going to probably use some integration tools that are going to leverage some of that integration procedures as you move forward. But I do want to talk at least a little bit about, what is a customer asset in field service and how do you use those inside the application? Customer assets are also important because as we get into the final module, we'll also talk a little bit about connected field service. And customer assets are one of the core pieces of functionality that are a part of the field service or connected field service solution. I want to talk also a little bit about the purchasing process. So how does field service handle POs, from requisitioning the PO to ensuring that that PO is associated with the correct work order, also making sure that we are receiving those products as they're coming in. We'll talk a little bit about how inventory adjustments and transfers work inside the application so you can manage inventory information. And then we'll also talk about how returns are processed and what specific sequences you follow when you're working with returns inside field service as well. A customer asset in field service is a serviceable item that is usually associated with some type of service location. So it might be a printer, it might be a physical piece of equipment that we have gone out and installed as part of a work order, and it is now sitting at a customer location, and now it's available for us to be able to go ahead and open work orders against in the future. Now, where customer assets come into play is in a couple of different situations. First, around agreements. So one of the things that we can do when we're creating these agreements and we're defining the work orders that are created through those agreements, we can associate that agreement or that work order with a specific customer asset. Now, from a reporting capability standpoint, we understand what it is, how often we've gone through. We can start to have kind of predictable patterns based upon what we're doing. Customer assets are also leveraged pretty heavily when you start talking about connected field service or the IoT solution that sits inside Dynamics 365 as well. So customer assets do come into quite a few different areas. When you start talking about how are you going to create and maintain this list of serviceable items in the application, there's a couple of different things that you can do. You can take into account specific information about the item. You can create historic logs of all the different work orders or items that were related to that. And you have the ability, depending upon what you're doing when it comes to customer assets, I can either just manually create the customer asset inside the system, or I do also have the capabilities if I need to, I can auto create the customer asset at the point in time when the initial work order where we installed that particular piece of equipment has been executed and completed inside the system. Now, customer assets have a couple of different options that you can work with. I can go in, as I mentioned, and I can auto-create them when a work order is closed. Work orders can be associated with a specific customer asset. They can be associated with a specific customer. So typically when you are creating a customer asset or a customer asset, you are going to associate it with a specific account. One asset could have multiple child assets. So you might have a situation where, we've got this product or this server rack that we've implemented. Now within that server rack, maybe there's 5 or 6 different servers that are all a part of that particular scenario. Each one of those servers could be individually defined as a customer asset within the application. And then, as I mentioned, the customer asset is really the foundation for how you are going to consume IoT devices inside that connected field service solution. So while you don't necessarily have to use customer assets only for IoT, they can be used just for preventative maintenance. They do also provide a nice option to be able to consume them as part of the connected field service solution. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a future module as well. So if I go into field service, and I will see underneath field service under service delivery, I will see a customer assets. And so when I click on customer assets, this is going to show me all of the different assets that I have in the system. Now you'll notice that some of these particular assets have a registration status associated with that. These would be assets that would be a part of the IoT solution and that would be registered as IoT devices in the system. So if you're not seeing something as registered, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not registered within the field service solution. It just means that it's not necessarily an IoT enabled device. It's just a standard customer asset. Now when I go in and click on new, this is where I can define specifics around this customer asset inside the system. So I do have the capabilities to define, what this item might be. So maybe I'll call this a 3D printer. I can associate this particular item with an account, so I can come into here and I can add this to a specific account. Now, if this is that example we talked about with the work order status, or we have a scenario where maybe it's the server rack and there's multiple servers associated with it, there is this concept of the parent asset and then the child assets. And this would now give us the capabilities if we had child assets, or if we wanted to associate this with a parent, we could do that. Once you associate it with a parent, then that asset would now become the master asset in that relationship that you would be working through. Also, if you have a situation where this asset is actually associated with a product that is in your product catalog, you can define that particular item inside there as well. And then if this was associated with a work order and an item was created from that work order standpoint, you would be able to see the work order product that was associated with this, or any related work orders that have been created for this particular customer asset. And that's also where you're seeing the sub asset. So if this had been designated as a master asset in the system, you would also see any of the sub assets in there as well that you could work through. Once you've defined what that specific information looks like, now I can go ahead in here, I can save it, and that's going to save and populate this information, and now it's available for me to start scheduling preventative maintenance against, or if I needed to potentially register it as an IoT device that I could consume inside the system. The inventory management capabilities of field service really center around warehouses and where specific physical locations of inventory are inside the application. And so we talked a little bit about warehouses in some of the previous modules, but remember that a warehouse is anywhere where you physically might store equipment inside the system. It could be a physical warehouse, like a main warehouse or a distribution center where inventory is coming in and out of. It could be a truck that is associated with a service technician, and we just need to make sure that we're maintaining inventory levels in that truck as the technician is going out and working through items. Within a specific warehouse, I have the availability to go in and see what the specific product inventory looks like for that warehouse. I can see what quantities are available. I can see what information or what quantities are currently allocated, what we have on hand, and what is currently on order. So as I go through and start associating some of these products with specific work orders in the system, and I've associated that warehouse with technicians that are delivering some of those services, things are going to start to get allocated in the system. And that way, if I have 5 or 6 of them on order, I know that maybe 4 of those are currently spoken for because they're going to be used onto a job. Now, just like anything from an inventory standpoint, we have this concept of adjustments and transfers. I want to go in and I want to adjust the inventory levels, maybe based upon items that we've received into a warehouse, or I want to be able to transfer inventory from one area to another. And really, they're the same type of record. One of them is just a singular warehouse transaction, and the other one involves multiple warehouses inside the system. And so when we start talking about a transfer, the biggest difference with a transfer record inside the system is we are going to define where the source warehouse is and where the destination warehouse is. Whereas if we're doing just a flat standard inventory adjustment, now we're just going into the warehouse that we want to work with, and we're just making baseline adjustments in the quantities to those individual situations. So let's hop into the app and take a look at how that inventory management process works inside the application. So I'm going to hop over into field service. And when I go into field service, I've got a couple of different situations. And the first thing I want to show you is if I go into warehouses. So when I go into warehouses, this is going to show me all the warehouses that we currently have in the system itself. And as I open up each one of these warehouses, I have the ability to go in and see all the product inventory that is associated with that warehouse. So for example, if I come up into my navigation bar next to main and I click on this, I will see a product inventory option. And this is going to show me all of the individual products that are now in this particular warehouse, and I can see how many I have available. I can see how many I have on hand. I also can see how many are currently on order. So if I have created any purchase orders that have any of that information associated with it. And then the allocated scenario allows us to see if any of these particular products have been associated as part of a PO that is attached to a work order. I can see that some of these have currently been allocated, so I know what is being spoken for as part of the application. Now, depending upon how you're integrating with maybe a third-party accounting application or what some of your specific needs are, a lot of times some of these inventory adjustments might take place in bulk through a bulk transaction or a bulk edit. However, the concept around what takes place is really just a what's called inventory transfer record that has a single or multiple products associated with it. So if I was to go into field service and go into inventory transfers, I can create an inventory transfer record by clicking on New, specifying the warehouse where I'm going to make this inventory transfer from. So I'm going to take products that is currently in the main warehouse or in the source warehouse of main, and I'm going to transfer this information to a secondary or to truck 1. Now I'm going to save my record, and then when I go back up into my navigation area, now I can define the specific products that I want to work with for this inventory transfer. So now I can create a new inventory adjustment record. Now, inventory adjustments are used whether it is a transfer record or whether it is just a flat inventory adjustment in the system. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new inventory adjustment record. And what you'll see in here from that standpoint of the record itself is when I come into the product, I can specify what product it is. I can specify the units or the default unit for this particular item, the quantity that I want to transfer from one item to another, so we'll say 10. Now the only difference, there we go. The only difference here is you'll see I have inventory adjustment and I have inventory transfer. If this is a transfer, then obviously the transfer number will be filled in. If this was just a flat adjustment of the inventory in the system, then the inventory adjustment option would be filled in based upon what you're looking at. But again, typically in most cases, you'll be looking at doing some of these inventory adjustments and transfers probably through some type of integration procedure that's really going to help facilitate and drive that information moving forward. As your technicians are, out working in the field or just through general day-to-day operations, at some point in time, you're going to need to requisition a PO because we probably will need some additional products that will need to come from vendors so we can stock our warehouses and make sure that we have the appropriate or the applicable levels of product available based upon maybe current jobs that we're trying to execute or future jobs that will be coming through down the pipeline as we move forward. Now, the purchase order process from a field service standpoint works has kind of a 3-step process that you're going to be working with. The first situation is you have to really requisition what are the products that you want to work with by creating a PO record inside the application. Now, when you create that PO record, we can do several different things around defining the specifics on what work order that PO PO is going to be associated with, how we're going to ship or drop ship that information, what warehouse that inventory may be received into. But as we define the specifics around the purchase order itself, then we're able to go in and gain approval. So there is potentially an approval process that can be used in the system to ensure that it is okay for us to proceed in ordering this information from the vendor. Now, as these products are coming in, you may receive all of the products from a specific PO at one time. They may trickle in over time, maybe based upon the fact that some of those items were back ordered, maybe some of those particular items were on hand, but then other items weren't necessarily available. So they may trickle in over time. So the purchasing order processing does give us the capabilities to really be able to go in and check products in as they're coming into the application itself. And so the first thing that I want to do is just pop into the application, we'll create a PO, and we'll walk through kind of that requisition process inside the application. So if I go into field service, I will see an option for purchase orders. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to requisition a PO for a specific item or area that I want to work with. So I'll go ahead and I'll click on New. Now I can come in for the PO and I can define specifics around that option. So the first thing that you'll see in here is system statuses. So all of these POs are going to come in with a draft status. You don't necessarily have the ability to go in and start receiving items on this PO until that PO has been submitted. And then as you start receiving information in, now we can update the statuses of the PO to products received or that the PO has been billed based upon different situations. I also have the ability, just like any record inside the system, I can use sub-statuses to drive specifics onto why that particular PO is maybe waiting for approval or something in that scenario. So you do have capabilities to really leverage what it is that you're looking for from a reporting perspective. Now, the other option that you'll see down on the PO itself, and again, just for space purposes, I'm just going to move this up a little bit. If I go into the purchase order date, this is the date that we are going to be requisitioning that PO. Who is the vendor that we're going to be ordering these products from? So this is where I can go in and define what specific vendor I want to pull this information in from. And then as I scroll down into the details section, this is where I can really start defining the specific information that's going to help drive not only how this information is received as we start receiving these products in, but how we would potentially allocate the inventory that's coming in based upon the information that we're receiving. So, when do I need this by? So this allows me to come out and say, okay, you know what, I'm going to need all these products by the 10th. Where am I shipping this information to? Am I going to ship this to the service account location? Am I going to ship this to one of the sites that we have defined for our organization inside the system? Is it going to a different location? In this case, I may say that we're going to ship it directly to the service account. Do I have any payment terms that I want to define within the context of this on how we're going to be working through this? Where am I shipping this via? So these are my different shipping methods or shipping providers that I can utilize. Do I want to receive this information into a warehouse? So as this product is coming in, do I physically want to go ahead and receive this into a warehouse so I can track it from an inventory standpoint? I also have the ability to associate this with a work order inside the system or with a booking inside the system. So if I currently have somebody who's been scheduled, I would have the capabilities to go out and say, okay, this is the booking or the resource that has been allocated or requested this purchase order product inside the system. From our standpoint, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just pick one of these work orders. Who is the person that has requested this information? I'm going to say it was requested by, we'll just say myself. And then, do I have it or is it approved or rejected by anybody in the system? This gives me the capabilities to define the approval status on this item. And so now if I were to come back up into my option here, now I have the capabilities to start working through this process. So now I can submit this particular PO. I can save it. Now I can approve it, define who's been basically approved from that standpoint. Advance to the next stage in the business process. And then once it's been submitted, now I have the ability to start receiving some of this information inside the application. So the next step to this is now products are going to start coming in associated with this item. Now, I haven't necessarily defined any products in here. If I scroll down towards the bottom, or up here at the top, I do have the ability to add specific product line items to this PO. So this is where I could come in here, add a specific purchase order product. Define how many of these that I want, and it's going to pull in the unit cost based upon the pricing information that we've defined in the system. Now, as I've added these products, eventually at some point these products are going to start coming in. And so this is where now I would have the ability to come into here and add a product or a PO receipt. And so this is where I can start keeping track of the actual products as they're coming into the application. So I can add a new kind of purchase order receipt. This is going to be the overall container that's going to define all the different products that are coming in under this receipt. So I will say that this is my monitor received by Derek. Then once I save this, then underneath this PO receipt, now I can go into receipt products, and this is where I can physically start receiving the products into inventory based upon those options. So now I can come into here and I can choose to show purchase order products that have not been fully received yet. I can see how many we have coming in. This is where I now can define how many we have actually received in the system. And then as I commit or save these changes, it's then going to allocate that inside the application. So now I have the ability to make kind of a document of the fact that all of these products or items have come in. And then as I go through, I can update individual quantities from here. And if I receive additional options in here, I can then update my individual scenarios from there. And then once all of the products have been received, then I can go through the process of actually billing it inside the system by creating a PO billing. Just as often as you're going to go in and request products or generate POs to request products based upon things that you would need for work orders that you're executing, a lot of times you're also going to have return information. And so returns can be processed and they follow pretty much the same pattern that you would see from a PO perspective. There's three ways that you can return products inside field service. You can either process it as a return to warehouse, as a return to vendor, or as a change in equipment ownership based upon your specific needs. Every single return processing option that you're going to utilize is going to start as a RMA or a return merchandise authorization, and then from there you can specify at that point if it's going to be a return to warehouse, return to vendor, or a change in ownership. Now, as I mentioned, it follows much the same process that you would see from a purchase order standpoint, in the fact that you're going to define those products that are going to be part of that RMA. You're going to then document that those have been received and brought back into the system, and then you can close out and process that process return from a billing perspective as well. Now, we're not necessarily going to go in and demo that functionality because it is very similar, but it's something to keep in mind that just as often as you're going to need to go in and work through POs, you're also going to be needing to work through return merchandise authorizations as well. Now, we've walked through how some of the inventory and back office management capabilities of field service work. I think things to keep in mind is oftentimes when you're going through an implementation, you are going to have requirements around integrations with back office applications, whether that's operations from a Dynamics 365 perspective, or whether that's some other third-party ERP system that you're going to be working with. So while it is important to understand the core concepts that make up inventory management inside the the system. It's also important to understand that in most cases, you will have to engage with either your organization or your customers around how that implementation methodology is going to work, specifically around back office scenarios. Are we going to be doing, just pushing invoices into ERP from that standpoint? Are we going to be doing account management and pushing through accounts into ERP? Or are we really truly going to do a full inventory integration? And if we're going to do a full inventory integration, where are those POs going to originate from? Are they going to originate from field service and then be pushed into the ERP system? And then as that information is received into inventory, pushed back into Dynamics 365 for field service? But what you want to really think about is, how is this going to affect your architecture and your design elements on how you're going to construct this field service implementation moving forward? Because ultimately, what integrations you have planned with your back office scenarios are going to drive all the customizations that you might need to make in the system as you move forward. From an inventory perspective, you can manage a lot of the different elements that are going to be used when you're going through and trying to process inventory inside field service. Be aware of the warehouses where those specific products might be located or allocated. Be aware of how you might want to transfer inventory from a primary warehouse over into a secondary warehouse. And really with just a little bit of planning, it makes it much easier to architect a solution that's going to take full advantage of the inventory management capabilities of field service, even if you're looking at potentially integrating that with another application as you're moving forward. And so as you're going through those options around field service, look at things around how those warehouses are going to be constructed. Look at situations on how you're going to be going through and utilizing the PO process. Under what circumstances are those POs going to be created, and how are they going to be allocated to specific work orders or bookings inside the system? As you're receiving those products in, do you want those products to be received or drop shipped into a specific warehouse, handed off to a customer location? How are we going to ensure that as we receive those items into inventory, that the appropriate quantities are being allocated to the work orders that they're actually associated with? And then when you run into situations where you may potentially need to go through and actually start requisitioning returns on return merchandise authorizations, how are you going to drive that functionality in the application as well? Understanding under what circumstances you need to start thinking about back office scenarios is very important from a field service standpoint. You want to make sure that you know what the expectations are going to be around inventory management and how that's going to be handled inside the system, but under what circumstances will technicians need to request information, whether it's via PO or some other type of mechanism. And it's also important to understand that not all of your work orders are going to be created on demand. Many times they're going to be preventative maintenance work orders that need to be utilized based upon a contract or service level agreement that you've entered into with a customer. And so in this course, we talked a little bit about what agreements were in Dynamics for field service, and more specifically, how those agreements can be used to define and automate not only work order creation, but how you can define and auto schedule bookings inside the system based upon the technician that you need to use to carry that information out. We also looked at how those agreements can be used to trigger scheduling or trigger invoicing on regularly scheduled definitions. So I might have bookings that are going out once a week or once every 2 weeks, but I want to go ahead and have my invoices being created monthly based upon those situations. We looked at customer assets and understand how customer assets are physical pieces of equipment that are going to be sitting at a customer location that we would have the capabilities to open and schedule work orders against at some point in time in the application. We talked about the purchasing process and how you can go in and requisition POs if there's specific product that you need for a work order item that you're going through. And we looked at how warehouses and inventory levels can be adjusted, whether that's going in and creating just adjustments inside the application, or whether that's fully going through and managing returns or managing transfers of inventory from one warehouse to another. Well, I hope you enjoyed our course and our overview on how to manage agreements and work with different items inside the application. Again, my name is Derek Borman. I want to say thank you very much for watching, everybody. Take care and have a good one.